Hello teachers, welcome back. This is now lesson 2, part 3 of 3. As a reminder, this is the content that we are teaching in our lesson 2 for Give Me 5 book 3. And as you remember, this is our story time. Now, this is the third part, so we've just finished doing our substitute exercise with our students. Teachers modeled well, the students understand the instruction, and the students are now working hard on their substitutions. In this particular example, I have asked the students to come up and read their substitutions. So what this particular group is, one of them is Ravi, one of them is Lily, and the other one is Josh. And they're just using that as a conversation. Now, if you want them to use it as a reading, have their books. If you want them to have it as a conversation, they're not allowed to look at their books. And if you want them to have it as a writing exercise, well, of course, then they're just copying it down into their notebooks, okay? It is really up to you how you want to use that structure, okay? And what kind of grading you want to have for the kids, okay? But in this particular example, they're just using it as a convo, and they're holding their books, but say that they have to keep their books behind their back, okay? Which is another method that I enjoy using. So they can look at the words and then they have to say the sentence out loud as if they were memorizing it, okay? So that's the way I do it for that one. Okay, now we finished our substitution. We've had our fun. We've given our points. The kids are now over. And whilst they were finishing up, I'm now erasing the board and the kids now sit down. I want to give them a couple of minutes just to kind of clear their brains. Why? Because now we're moving on to something quite challenging. And if your students are kind of weak, you as the teacher are not able to move so quickly. You as a teacher have really got to support your kids. So I just want to give them a couple of minutes to clear their brains, maybe go drink some water or something, I don't know. But then I'll say, all right, boys and girls, please close your books. And the teacher's going to write on the board. Boys and girls, do you guys remember in the story, school begins, do you remember school begins? When does school begin? School begins, and then some kid might remember and say, teacher, at 9 o'clock. Bingo, good job. Boys and girls, follow me. School begins at 9 o'clock, and everybody says it. And the kid who got it right, you give them a card or you give them a point or whatever it is. Next one, boys and girls, do you remember in panel number 1, the first lesson? What was the first lesson? What was it? The first lesson is, and the kids will then, and then hopefully one kid will then shout out arts and crafts. Good job, it's arts and crafts. So you will go through that as you build up the whiteboard, okay? And as you build up all of the sentences. And you'll ask 1 or 2 kids, or you'll ask a table what the correct fact was, okay? What are the facts of the story? Now, I asked my kids to close their books, but in this particular example, you could ask your kids to keep their books open, and then they can just look around for the facts, okay? You start the sentence, and then they complete it. Once they finish those sentences, now you can ask them to close their books because I want to bring in a grammar point. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, all right, boys and girls, school begins at 9 o'clock. Who can give me the opposites? This is the opposites game. And the kids might be like, what do you mean opposites? All right, school begins at 10 o'clock. What do you mean? No, boys and girls, school doesn't begin at 9 o'clock. That is the opposite of school begins at 9 o'clock. Says all the kids. All right, boys and girls, who can give me an opposite for the next one? The first lesson is arts and crafts. Now, some students might say, well, the second lesson is math, or the second lesson is arts and crafts, or the second lesson isn't arts and crafts. Whoever gets it right, boys and girls, okay, that's doesn't, sorry. The first lesson isn't arts and crafts, and then you underline isn't. Now your students start to understand, wait a minute, we're just gonna throw the negative in there. And so then you go on through those facts, and now we're throwing in the negative. The children aren't making bracelets. Now, here is something that I want the kids to really use their brains for. It's a trap that I made for them. Josh is not very good at making bracelets. So what's the answer? Some students might say, Josh is not very good at making bracelets. Or some kids might even say, Josh isn't not very good at making bracelets. But of course, the opposite is Josh is very good at making bracelets. The knot is on that left-hand side. Haha. And so basically you're really stimulating our students like brains at this stage. And it's towards the end of the lesson, so they're probably a little bit burnt out. But either way, you're needing to really reinforce the grammar point of this. The children play basketball. Boys and girls, what's the negative? The children don't play basketball. Now we've got the positives on the left-hand side pretty much, and the negatives on the right-hand side, the opposites on the right-hand side, that's for sure. And through this structure, we can extend it further if we need to have more examples, or if the students got it already, we can move on to the next step. But what I want to draw your attention to, teachers, and maybe you can see it already, and that is Teacher Stephen has made sure to cover as many of the verbs as possible. So does, doesn't, is, isn't, are, aren't, do, don't. Okay, and that's the reason why I took out those sentences. We want to make sure that we can spread across as many grammar points as we possibly can. Now, once my students have understood that structure, now the teacher's going to throw in the questions. All right, boys and girls, look at number 1 at the top. School begins at 9 o'clock. Who can give me the question? Is it what begins, when begins, or where begins? Oh, I'm sorry. That was for a dialogue. The students can have a dialogue if you want to. If you want to have one person giving the positive and another person giving the negative, that's okay. You can have it as a dialogue game. But now I want to move into the question. Question is, when does school begin? Correct. Boys and girls, for the question at the top, number 1, school doesn't begin at 9 o'clock. What's the question? Now your students are going to say, when doesn't school begin? But of course, that's not what we want. Does school begin at 9 o'clock? Nah, school doesn't begin at 9 o'clock. All right. Now the kids' brains are really going, really thinking really hard. If they get it, now you can ask them orally. All right, boys and girls, next one. The first lesson is arts and crafts. What's the question? What is the first lesson? What is the first lesson? The first lesson is arts and crafts. Is the first lesson arts and crafts? So you're giving them another example. Now you allow the students to use it orally, okay? And allow them to kind of practice their English. You have created a beautiful information gap, okay? A Socratic method, if you want to call it that. And you've allowed the students now a structure with it. They have to then fill in the answers. Okay, we go through that as long as you possibly can as the teacher. And then finally, you will write down, sorry about this, you will write down the questions on the board if they were really struggling. If they're not struggling, you can ask them to take out their notebooks and write down the questions and then the answers as well, as many or as few as you need. Phew. Teachers, that really is, it's quite complex and it's quite a challenge, but don't forget, this is now Give Me 5 Book 3. So certainly our students are needing to be challenged at this particular level. If you have any comments, please do write them down below. I'm happy to read them and I'm happy to respond to you there. All that's left for me to say is thank you very much for watching and I shall see you in the next video. Take care until then and bye-bye.